What's going on, guys? Manny here. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. In this episode we're going to take a detailed look at dynamic belaying, and I basically want to share all the different tips and tricks, all the experience that I've gained over the years of being a sport climber, being a route climber, a rock climber. And yeah, maybe you're struggling with fear of falling. You want to get your first fall training done, but you're kind of hesitant because you don't have the experience with dynamic belaying, and as we know, that's quite important when it comes to a proper fall training. So this video is definitely going to help you out. We're going to take a look at what dynamic belaying actually is, why we need it, and what the different methods are to basically produce a dynamic catch. So if you're struggling with all these things, stay tuned. We're gonna take a look at it. This video is long overdue. Let's get started. So what exactly is dynamic belaying? What is a dynamic catch and why do we need it? In very simple words, we can say the main mechanism for achieving a dynamic catch is reducing the pulling resistance of the rope in the moment of impact of the climber into the harness in case of a fall. So we need this because especially in lead, these forces can become really strong, much stronger than compared to top roping, for example, where still, all of the elasticity of all that rope that is out acts as a quite good attenuator of the fall. A little thinking experiment to understand that. Let's assume we fix the belaying end of our rope to some static structure while our friend is climbing up there. If he falls, he will get a static catch, and the only cushioning factor on his impact into the harness will be the elasticity of the rope. It's gonna be a very unpleasant fall. We've got high impact on the hips and the spine, and even more important, we've got a strong pull towards the wall if the line between the climber and his last clipped quick draw is not completely vertical. And this is one of the most common sources actually of injury through lead climbing. This strong pull towards the wall will in turn cause a high impact on feet and hands, which can result in ankle injuries and wrist injuries and all the sorts of that. So right away, here's my first tip for the climber. If your fall is somewhat controlled, do not jump away from the wall when letting go. Simply let yourself fall down. I see this all the time with beginners. They tend to be a little bit afraid from the wall and all of its structures, so they push themselves to the back when they let go. But this is only going to result in a stronger pull towards the wall later on. If you're simply letting yourself fall down, you don't increase the horizontal distance between you and the wall, and this will result in a smaller pull towards the wall later on. I hope that makes sense. Also, a strong pull to the wall will worsen the consequences of an uncontrolled fall dramatically. So what is an uncontrolled fall? Well, let's say you're slipping one foot while climbing, get a barn door and get a little bit of a spin in your body, and then you fall off. There's a chance that you won't hit the wall with your feet first. Another even more critical example would be if your feet get caught in the rope during the fall. This can happen if you made a mistake in your rope management during climbing, or sometimes when you're just very unlucky and you have a very high distance between the last clipped quick draw and your climbing position. Once the rope gets tight, it will turn you around, which will make you lose control over the impact on the wall completely. So here's my second tip for the climber. Always keep the rope between your legs and the wall. Try to never climb with the rope behind your legs. This will prevent you from getting caught in the rope and losing control over your fall. Also, we can have a little bit of a discussion about grabbing the knot. Some people tend to grab the knot every time when they fall because it gives them the feeling of security, it keeps them upright, and it ensures that they hit the wall with their feet first. Now, I am personally one of these persons who does this as well. I can't really recommend it because there are pros and cons to this. The pro is that you basically keep a lot of control over your fall, you keep very upright, and you will have basically insurance that you're gonna hit the wall with your feet first. On the other hand, you don't have free hands if you're grabbing the knot, so you can't really protect your head from the impact on the wall. Now, this shouldn't be necessary if your feet get there first anyway, but I just want to have that mentioned. So some people always recommend not grabbing the knot to have all four extremities to basically protect yourself from the impact on the wall. So in the case of uncontrolled falls, a dynamic dynamic catch is of special importance since it will allow the climber for a very soft impact on the wall or even no impact at all if the conditions allow it, if it's very overhanging, for example, and there's a lot of air below you. Here a quick word about helmets. Uncontrolled falls are the main reason why I would recommend at least a climber to wear a helmet during a fall training, since it can protect you from wall impacts on the head. So right away, a sorry for not ticking this box in some of these examples that I'm going to show in this video. We made these shots kind of spontaneously when we had some spare time, and I usually don't bring my helmet to the gym. I only bring it when there's a substantial danger of rock falls, like alpine stuff or via ferratas and such stuff like that. So here's my recommendation: bring a helmet, at least for the climber, if you're planning to do a serious fall training. So now that we know why we actually need dynamic belaying and how it decreases the chance of injury of the climber, especially during lead climbing falls, the question arises: how can we as belayers ensure proper dynamic catches when they are necessary? As I said earlier, a dynamic catch is achieved by reducing the pulling resistance of the rope in the moment of impact of the climber into the harness, into the rope basically. So from this we can derive the, as I think, most important conclusion, or let's say the most important lesson which the belayer has to learn. Dynamic belaying is all about timing. As a good dynamic belayer, you have to have a feeling for when your falling climber is going to be caught by his harness and starts pulling the rope. If you can anticipate this time point, if you take appropriate measures combined with proper timing, this will maximize your success as a dynamic belayer. On the contrary, if you're trying to give a dynamic catch with wrong timing, this will drastically reduce the effectiveness of your efforts and, in the worst case, will even worsen the falling experience of your climber, compared to if you have taken no measures for a dynamic catch at all. Timing is number one. So how can we predict the impact of the climber into his harness at any given situation? This will get a lot better as your experience grows, but I'll try to give you some orientation here if you're a complete beginner. The time until the climber hits the harness and starts pulling on the rope, so to say, is essentially the result of two variables. First, we've got the vertical distance between the harness, so essentially the hips of the climber, and the last clipped quick draw in the moment of the fall. Obviously, the higher the climber above the last clipped quick draw, the more time is going to pass until the climber will pull the rope. I also said vertical distance for a reason, because let's assume we have a complete roof. The distance between the climber and the last clipped quick draw might be great, but the vertical distance can still be zero. Therefore, the climber will pull on the rope instantly as soon as he falls, first with little force and then with more and more force. The second variable is the amount of slack you have pulled out. Obviously, the more slack you've got pulled out, the longer it's going to take until the climber hits the harness and pulls the rope. So here comes my first tip for belayers. Keep the amount of slack you've got out at a minimum. This will allow you to anticipate the moment of impact of your climber much more accurately. Excessive amounts of slack are actually only in very rare scenarios advantageous. In the vast majority of the cases, it's actually disadvantageous because, again, it's only going to make it harder to predict the moment of impact. Furthermore, it will just increase the forces at play once the climber hits the harness due to the longer falling time and therefore greater falling speed. And additionally, it's going to be much harder or even impossible for the climber to get back on the route after the fall. If the route is at least a little bit overhanging. So who knows, maybe he'd like to keep projecting. Keeping all that in mind, you despite that want to have enough slack out for your climber to be able to move freely, of course. So I always go by the following rule of thumb. If the rope between belaying device and first clipped quick draw hangs lower than the belaying device, it's usually too much slack. Taking into account proper positioning of the belayer on the ground, this will mean a slack amount of usually not more than 1 meter. So let's calculate some examples here in order to give you some guiding values. Let's assume your climber falls with the last clipped quick draw at his hips. So the vertical distance is basically 0 and you've got 1 meter of slack out. That means 1 meter of falling. How much time does it take for something to fall 1 meter if we exclude air resistance? This can be solved with the following formula for distance after a certain time of constant acceleration. Distance is acceleration times time to the power of 2 divided by 2. Now if we reform this formula towards the time, we get time is the square root of 2 times the distance divided by the acceleration. Now in our case, the acceleration is the constant acceleration that is caused by gravity, which is 9.81 meters per square second. And we also know the distance, which is 1 meter, so we can calculate how much time it takes. And this time results in 0.45, or let's say roughly 0.5 seconds for 1 meter of falling distance. So that means if your climber is falling with his hips at the last clipped quick draw and you've got 1 meter of slack out, it's going to take roughly 0.5 seconds until he's going to hit the harness. So let's assume your climber is 1 meter above the last clip quick draw. That's gonna mean 2 meters of falling plus 1 meter of slack, 3 meters of falling distance. This results in 0.78 or roughly 0.8 seconds for 3 meters of falling for 1 meter above the last clipped quick draw. So let's assume your climber is 2 meters above the last clipped quick draw. You've got a badass climber here, maybe he skipped some clipping. That's going to add up to 5 meters of falling distance, because remember, your climber has to fall the 2 meters towards the last clip quick draw, then additionally 2 meters because of all the rope that's out, and then there is the 1 meter of slack that you've got out down there. So that's 5 meters of falling, and for 5 meters we've got 1 second. So it takes the climber roughly 1 second until he hits the harness, if he starts falling 2 meters above his last clipped quick draw. So let's make it even more extreme. We've got 3 meters above the last clipped quick draw. That's gonna mean 7 meters of falling, and here we've got 1.2 seconds for these 7 meters of falling time. So as you can see, it's pretty safe to say that for most lead falls, it will take the climber half a second to a second until he or she hits the harness. If they are not total badass and climb like 5 meters above the last clipped quick draw, but even then, if you're falling like 11 meters, it's only going to take you 1.5 seconds until you hit the harness. So this narrows it down quite nicely for us belayers. The main point here is, if you see your lead climber falling, the impact will not occur instantly. Depending on how much slack you've got out and how high he's above the last clipped quick draw, it will take roughly 0.5 to 1 second in most cases. This is when the impact comes, and this is when you have to act in order to ensure a dynamic catch. So now that we've got our timing on point, we can actually take a look at what the things are that you can do in order to ensure a dynamic catch. And there's 3 main methods to work with here. First, we've got the jumping method. Secondly, we've got the walking method. And thirdly, we've got the sliding rope through belaying device method. Keep in mind that these can be mixed and combined depending on the belaying situation. I will now take a closer look at all of them individually and try to give you some tips to really refine your dynamic belaying game to the best of my ability. First, I want to hit the sliding rope through belaying device method real quickly. For me, this one has the least relevance when it comes to regular single pitch sport climbing. Why? Because when I'm sport climbing, I'm belaying 100% of the time with a gree-gree, and honestly, I'd recommend you to do the same. I've talked about this before. If you're new to the whole belaying device craze, I'd recommend you to check out my video about the gree-gree, on how to belay with a gree-gree basically. The gree-gree, like many other modern belaying devices, is a semi-automatic belaying device, which means that it's going to lock the rope as soon as a rapid force pulls on it. At least if you're having your braking hand in place, which you of course always should have, also with semi-automatic belaying devices. That means that the sliding rope through belaying device method is pretty much out the window as soon as you're belaying with semi-automatics. However, tubers and stuff like that still have a place in alpine climbing. Imagine belaying your partner on lead from an anchor in the middle of the wall with a gree-gree. No space to jump, no space to move, without the option of sliding a bit of rope through. That's gonna be a static catch. A tuber will allow you to at least get a little bit of rope through before going tight, ensuring a more dynamic catch, and therefore the tuber is here the better choice, alongside with other advantages of course. So essentially the disadvantage of the gree-gree regarding dynamic belaying is its advantage regarding general safety. It's going to lock the rope. So frankly, even if you get belayed by a complete idiot who doesn't pay any attention, you will at least get a static catch as opposed to what could have been a grounder in the worst case with a tuber. So since we can't slide rope through the device in the case of a semi-automatic belaying device during the fall, we have to rely on the other two methods to produce a dynamic catch reliably, the jumping and the walking method, and I'll discuss these two together here because they are a bit intertwined. For the walking method, you create some distance to the wall while your partner climbs, and as soon as your partner falls, you move towards the wall, closing the gap, attenuating the impact of your partner. Here are the advantages of this method. First of all, walking towards the wall is a relatively smooth motion. Therefore, you don't have to be 100% accurate in anticipating the moment of impact, especially if there's a lot of space to move. Secondly, standing further away from the wall will sometimes allow you to better observe your climber, therefore increasing your accuracy in anticipating the moment of impact. Most importantly though, this method will be very effective when the climber is considerably lighter than the belayer. The reason for this is that due to the sharp angle of the rope between belayer and wall, the climber will pull on the belayer's end with a lot more force, since he only needs to pull the belayer in the plane of the ground and not against gravity, especially in the moment of impact, when there's still a large gap between belayer and wall, if that makes sense. But there are also some disadvantages. We just talked about the climber pulling on the belayer's end with a strong force. This will become a problem real quickly if the climber is equally heavy or even heavier than the belayer. The resulting strong pull towards the wall can actually become dangerous to the belayer, who then has to protect himself from the impact with hands and feet and might even let go of the braking hand and all that non-ideal stuff. Leads to another tip. Good belayers always wear solid shoes. This will give them the confidence to jump against the wall if necessary, which will keep their hands on the belaying rope, on the braking rope, and this is of course going to increase the security of the climber. Another disadvantage of the walking method is that it's not very versatile when it comes to terrain. You need a lot of space on the ground with little to no obstacles. This might be the case in climbing gyms, but rarely occurs outdoors. For example, in this area, this ledge I'm belaying from here is only like 1.5 meters wide, so I can't really move horizontally to attenuate a fall. Here I have to move more vertically, which leads me to the third method we have to discuss, the jumping method. Here the climber produces a dynamic catch by jumping upwards in the moment of the climber's impact into the harness, and the belayer is actually standing very close to the wall compared to the walking method. The advantages of the jumping method are firstly that you can use this method in any terrain. No matter how bad the ground might look like, nothing can really prevent you from jumping up the wall a bit. Secondly, this method works quite well if the climber is equally heavy or even heavier than the belayer. In fact, if the climber is a lot heavier, the belayer doesn't need to do anything but just stand there in the right position and wait for the impact, which is then simply going to pull him up as much as necessary. For me, I am usually around 63 kilograms, a bit lighter than most of my climbing partners. This is the go-to method, which literally always works and yields good results. However, there are also disadvantages. Jumping is not as much of a smooth movement as walking. Therefore, you have to get more accurate in your timing compared to the walking method. This is crucial. Imagine jumping too early. You as a belayer might fall down again in the moment of impact of your climber, which will result in a greater antagonistic force than if you wouldn't have jumped at all, and therefore a very harsh catch. So especially here, timing is number one. Also, standing close to the wall can make it harder to observe your climber, which in turn can make it even harder to predict the moment of impact. So I want to discuss one important additional point in this context real quickly. A lot of times I had the situation with beginners, as their partners would climb higher and higher, belayers would walk back further and further away from the wall to still be able to observe their climbers properly. However, without noticing it, they went from a jumping method into a walking method scenario, which was fine, except for those cases where the climber was actually heavier than the belayer. So here comes another tip. Get proper belaying glasses. They will allow you to observe your partner comfortably from any spot on the ground, so your positioning is not compromised by that anymore. They will also save your neck and shoulders down the road, trust me on that one. I'll try to get some sort of link to some of these glasses in the description of this video so that you can see what I mean and check them out. There's one more, a bit tricky disadvantage of the jumping method when used in combination with a gree that I want to have mentioned here. Sometimes the first clipped quick draw is quite close to the ground. Maybe the root has a cruxy start or something. Now, if the belayer is considerably lighter than the climber, he's going to get pulled up a lot in case of a bigger fall. And there have been reported cases where the first clipped quick draw literally pushed open the locking mechanism of the gree since the belayer got pulled up against it. So never let go of your braking rope. This is imperative as always. One quite effective measure to prevent this is to unclip the first quick draw as soon as your climber is in a safe spot higher up. But of course that's only possible if you can actually reach it from the ground. So these are the things you have to keep in mind when deciding to go for the walking or the jumping method. What matters is the weight ratio of climber to belayer, the ground terrain, and how accurate you are with your timing already. My general advice for lighter people would be to specialize in the jumping method, while heavier people should try to perfect the walking method or a mix of jumping and walking. I think these will yield them the best results regarding dynamic belaying in the long run. Now, before I forget to mention it, please keep in mind that the closer your climber still is to the ground, the less room there is for dynamic belaying. And sometimes you might have to go for a more harsh catch in order to prevent a grounder or a crash of the climber and the belayer. Speaking of which, these can sometimes be avoided by lateral positioning along the wall of the belayer. However, in some cases, climber and belayer just come really close after a fall. This depends more on how the balls are placed on the root than on the actual belayer positioning. Just pay attention in these cases. I think we've covered pretty much everything you need to know now for a good start for a good first fall training. You now know what dynamic belaying is and why we need it. You know about the importance of timing and that it will take the climber in between 0.5 to 1 second until he hits the harness in the vast majority of the cases. You know about the 3 methods of attenuating a fall: the jumping method, the walking method, and the sliding rope through belaying device method, which goes out the window as soon as you belay with semi-automatics, which I would highly recommend in a single pitch sport climbing scenario. You know their advantages and disadvantages and therefore their areas of use. So now it's your turn to get some proper fall training done, generate some experience with dynamic belaying. Practice makes perfect. And finally get rid of your fear of falling to push your performance to the next level. As always, I hope you've got something from this video. Let me know down below if you did by dropping some likes and comments. I'd highly appreciate it. Isn't it incredible that you just got all this information for free? Just think a second about how much money the course hours would have cost you. YouTube is truly an incredibly powerful tool. Anyway guys, stay strong, keep crushing, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.